Think about this for a second. If you rob a bank today in the United States and try to make a run for it, your odds of escaping are virtually zero. The moment you speed away, an invisible net drops over you. License plate readers track your car on the highway. Cell towers ping your phone's exact location. The FBI steps in. Federal databases flag your face. Local police, state troopers, and federal SWAT teams coordinate across state lines without missing a single beat. We are so used to this massive, interconnected web of federal law enforcement that we assume it has always been there. We treat the FBI and federal agents like some ancient pillar of American life, like gravity or the Constitution itself. But here is the thing. For the first 132 years of its existence, the United States of America did not have a federal police force. None. No FBI, no DEA, no federal agents kicking down doors. If you robbed a bank in 1890, you didn't have to outrun a massive federal machine. You didn't have to worry about a nationwide manhunt. You just had to do one very simple, incredibly effective thing. You just had to cross the state line. That was it. That was the magic trick. If you committed a crime in Texas and managed to drag yourself just 1 inch over the border into Oklahoma, the Texas law enforcement officers literally had to stop chasing you. Their silver badges, their authority, their guns, they all lost their power the exact moment they crossed that invisible line drawn on a map. To the local sheriff, you were officially out of their jurisdiction. And to the federal government in Washington, D.C., you simply weren't their problem. So, the question isn't just academic. It's actually kind of urgent. How did an entire continental empire, a country expanding at a violent and chaotic pace, survive for over a century when the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card was literally just stepping across a dirt border? And perhaps more importantly, what terrified the government so much in 1908 that they decided to fundamentally rewire the justice system and build the most powerful law enforcement agency the world has ever seen? To understand why the system was set up this way, you have to look at the men who built it. Because here is the thing most people simply do not realize. The Founding Fathers didn't just forget to create a federal police force. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't an accident. They actively, intentionally, and passionately refused to build one. You have to remember exactly what these men had just lived through. They had just fought a brutal, exhausting revolution against a British king who used his royal soldiers to enforce laws, collect taxes, and spy on ordinary citizens. The British military essentially acted as the king's personal, unchecked police force. They could kick down your door, search your home without a warrant, and drag you away in the middle of the night. The absolute last thing the founders wanted was to hand that exact same power to a new federal government sitting in Washington. They were deeply, almost pathologically allergic to the idea of a centralized, national police force. In their minds, a federal police force was just a stepping stone to a secret police. To them, a national police force and a standing army were basically the exact same thing. They believed that if the federal government had its own cops, those cops would eventually be used to spy on political enemies, silence critics, and crush opposition. And ironically, history would later prove them absolutely right about that fear. So, they designed a constitutional architecture explicitly meant to keep law enforcement local. The idea was simple. If a crime happens in your town, your local sheriff handles it. If it happens in your state government handles it. The federal government was supposed to deal with national defense, foreign diplomacy, and delivering the mail. That was it. They built a system where power was decentralized, divided, and kept as far away from the federal capital as possible. And for a long time, this arrangement actually worked. The country was largely rural. Communities policed themselves. But as the nation began to violently expand westward, as railroads stitched the continent together, and as criminals became faster and smarter, this brilliant constitutional safeguard started to look like a massive, glaring vulnerability. Because the criminals quickly realized something the founders hadn't anticipated. The criminals realized very quickly that the expanding railroad system didn't just move cattle and coal, it moved them. Fast. Let's say you just robbed a train in Missouri. The local sheriff is hot on your trail, riding fast. But you have a head start, and you make it across the border into Arkansas. What happens next? The Missouri sheriff has to pull back the reins. He cannot legally arrest you in Arkansas. If he crosses that line and puts you in handcuffs, he is technically committing a kidnapping. So, what was the legal process to bring you back to face justice? It was a process called extradition. And in the late 1800s, it was an absolute laughable nightmare. To get you back, the Missouri sheriff had to go to his local judge. That judge had to draft a formal request to the governor of Missouri. The governor of Missouri then had to review it, sign it, and send a formal request to the governor of Arkansas. If the governor of Arkansas actually felt like reading it, he would eventually send an order down to the local Arkansas sheriff to find you and arrest you. Think about how absurdly slow that is. This was an era before telephones, before digital databases, before instant communication. This mountain of paperwork took weeks, sometimes months, traveling by horse or slow train. And even if the paperwork magically cleared, there was a fatal flaw in the system: the local Arkansas sheriff. Outlaws usually had plenty of stolen cash. Local sheriffs were wildly underpaid. So, when the extradition papers finally arrived, the outlaw would simply slide a few $100s across a saloon table. Suddenly, the local sheriff would fail to locate the suspect. The outlaw would pack up, ride off to the next state, and the whole miserable cycle would start all over again. It was a jurisdictional disaster. The United States was rapidly industrializing, but its justice system was stuck in the colonial era. But nature hates a vacuum. In capitalist America, if the government cannot provide a service, someone else will sell it to you. If the local sheriff couldn't cross state lines, the wealthy elite realized they needed to hire someone who could. The system was completely broken. But here is the brutal reality about American history. A broken system usually only affects the people who cannot afford to bypass it. If you were a poor farmer whose horse got stolen, you were out of luck. The local sheriff was not going to chase a horse across 3 states. But if you were a railroad tycoon, a bank president, or a wealthy industrialist, and a gang of outlaws just blew up your train safe and stole $50,000, you didn't wait around for the governor's extradition paperwork. You simply bought your own justice. Welcome to the era of the privatized police force. Since the federal government refused to create a national law enforcement agency, the free market stepped in to fill the void. And the most famous, most ruthless, and most effective organization to fill that void was the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Founded by a Scottish immigrant named Alan Pinkerton in the 1850s, the agency offered a service that the government literally could not provide. Pinkerton detectives did not care about state lines. They did not care about local jurisdictions. They didn't need a governor's permission to cross a border. If you paid their fee, they would track a criminal from New York to California, and they would not stop until they got their man. They were highly trained, impeccably dressed, and absolutely relentless. Their company logo was a giant, unblinking eye with the slogan, "We never sleep." That logo, by the way, is exactly where the term private eye comes from. For the robber barons of the Gilded Age, the Pinkertons were the ultimate problem solvers. But they weren't just solving train robberies anymore. The wealthy elite soon realized that if you can pay an agency to hunt down outlaws, you can also pay them to crush anyone who stands in the way of your profits. The Pinkertons were rapidly transforming from a simple detective agency into something much darker, much more violent, and vastly more powerful. They were building a private corporate army. And very soon, that private army would become larger than the military of the United States itself. By the late 1890s, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency had grown into an absolute monster. They weren't just a group of guys in suits looking for stolen cash anymore. They had amassed a force of over 2,000 active agents and 30,000 reserves. To put that into perspective, at that exact same time, the regular standing army of the United States had fewer soldiers than that. Let that sink in. A private for-profit corporation had a larger, better-armed military force than the federal government. They were famous for chasing down legendary outlaws like Jesse James and the James Younger Gang. They pursued the wild bunch across state lines, pushing them into corners local sheriffs could never reach. But as their power grew, their mission shifted. The massive railroad monopolies and steel tycoons stopped using them just to catch bank robbers. They started using this private army to crush the American working class. When coal miners or steel workers went on strike to demand safe working conditions or a living wage, the corporations didn't call the police. They called the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons became a ruthless corporate militia. They infiltrated labor unions, acted as armed guards, and violently broke up strikes. The most infamous clash happened during the Homestead Strike of 1892, where Pinkerton agents engaged in a massive, bloody gunfight with striking steelworkers. People died. The violence shocked the nation. Ordinary Americans looked at the Pinkertons and saw exactly what the Founding Fathers had warned them about: a secret police force. But it was worse, because this force didn't answer to the Constitution, or to the voters, or to the president. They answered only to whoever wrote the biggest check. The federal government finally realized it had a massive problem. They were completely reliant on a private army they could not control. But even with the public outrage, Congress still refused to create a federal police force. They were too paralyzed by the fear of a centralized police state. It was going to take a catastrophic shock to force their hand. And that shock arrived in the form of 2 bullets, fired at point-blank range, directly into the chest of the President of the United States. In September 1901, President William McKinley was shaking hands with the public at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Waiting in that line was a man named Leon Czolgosz. He was an anarchist, and he had a revolver completely hidden under a handkerchief. He stepped right up to the president, fired 2 shots at point-blank range, and shattered the American illusion of safety forever. McKinley died 8 days later. Now, you might be asking yourself a very logical question. Where was the Secret Service? Where were the federal bodyguards? Here is the shocking truth. The federal bodyguards were not there, because protecting the President of the United States was not actually their job. The Secret Service had been created back in 1865 for one extremely specific reason: to catch counterfeit money. During the Civil War, nearly a third of all paper currency in circulation was completely fake. So, the Secret Service belonged to the Treasury Department. Their only legal duty was to protect the integrity of the dollar bill, not the human being sitting in the Oval Office. McKinley's assassination sent a massive, paralyzing wave of panic through Washington, D.C. The man who killed him was part of a radical, violent political movement that absolutely terrified the American ruling class. Anarchists were blowing up buildings and assassinating leaders all over Europe. And now, they had murdered an American president. But this assassination exposed the horrifying reality of the jurisdictional nightmare. Anarchists and radical groups did not care about state lines. They were highly mobile. They were moving across borders on trains, sharing weapons, printing underground newspapers, and organizing on a national level. And the United States government had absolutely zero machinery to track them. A local sheriff in Ohio had no way of knowing if a dangerous radical was boarding a train to New York. The government finally woke up. The president was dead, and it was painfully obvious that a modernized, industrialized nation could not survive if criminals could travel nationally while the police were stuck locally. The new president, Theodore Roosevelt, immediately went to Congress. He demanded they create a federal investigative force to track these national threats. And Congress, in a move that seems almost completely insane to us today, looked the president dead in the eye and said no. President Theodore Roosevelt was a man who absolutely did not accept the word no. He was aggressive, visionary, and fiercely determined to bring order to a chaotic country. When he demanded a federal police force to hunt down national threats, he expected Congress to fall in line. But Congress completely rebelled. Why? Why would politicians refuse to protect their own country right after a president was brutally assassinated? The public reason they gave was the exact same fear the Founding Fathers had. Politicians gave fiery speeches warning that a federal police force would inevitably turn into a secret police. They claimed America would become like the oppressive regimes in Europe, with government spies hiding in the shadows, listening to private conversations, and crushing civil liberties. But, behind closed doors, there was a much more selfish, highly secretive reason. The early 1900s was an era of massive, unchecked political corruption. Congressmen were routinely taking bribes from railroad tycoons, land speculators, and massive corporate monopolies. Dirty money and backroom deals were simply how Washington operated. The politicians in Congress looked at Teddy Roosevelt, and they realized something absolutely terrifying. If they gave this aggressive, reform-minded president his own personal army of federal investigators, who was he going to investigate first? The anarchists? The train robbers? No. He was going to investigate them. Congress was terrified that Roosevelt would use this new federal police force to spy on his political enemies, uncover their corruption, and throw half of Washington, D.C. into federal prison. So, in the spring of 1908, Congress didn't just reject Roosevelt's request. They actually went a step further. They passed a strict law explicitly banning the Department of Justice from even borrowing agents from the Treasury's Secret Service. They completely stripped the executive branch of any ability to investigate anything on a national level. The politicians smiled. They had successfully defended their corrupt system. They had completely boxed the president in. They thought the debate was officially over. But they severely underestimated Theodore Roosevelt. Because when Congress legally banned him from creating a federal police force in the light of day, Roosevelt simply decided to build one in the dark. Theodore Roosevelt was not the kind of man who accepted defeat. If the front door was locked, he was going to kick down the back door. To pull this off, he enlisted the help of his fiercely loyal Attorney General, a man named Charles Bonaparte. And yes, in one of history's great, bizarre ironies, he was the literal great-nephew of the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Roosevelt and Bonaparte knew that Congress was never going to vote to create a federal police force. The politicians were too corrupt and too scared. So Roosevelt and Bonaparte decided they simply wouldn't ask for a vote. They would just wait for Congress to leave town. In the summer of 1908, Congress went on their usual recess. The politicians packed their bags and headed home, completely confident that they had stopped the president from building his feared secret police. The exact moment they were gone, Bonaparte made his move. He dug deep into the Department of Justice's budget and found a small, easily overlooked pool of discretionary funds. Using this hidden money, he quietly hired exactly 34 investigators. Many of these men were the exact same former Secret Service agents that Congress had just legally banned from working for the DOJ. Bonaparte hired them anyway, officially classifying them as special agents. On July 26, 1908, while Congress was completely blind to what was happening, Bonaparte issued a quiet, internal memo. He instructed his new team of special agents to report directly to a chief examiner. There was no grand press conference. There was no signing ceremony. There was no democratic debate. With just a stroke of a pen and a few $1,000s hidden in a budget loophole, the American Federal Police Force was born in the shadows. They called it the Bureau of Investigation. Decades later, they would add the word federal, and it would become the legendary FBI. When Congress finally returned to Washington in the fall, they were absolutely furious. The president had completely bypassed them and built the exact police force they had explicitly tried to ban. But it was too late. The machine had already been turned on. However, this new bureau was tiny. It only had 34 guys, and they actually had very little legal jurisdiction. To become the unstoppable monster it is today, the Bureau needed a massive expansion of legal authority. And to get that power, they used the oldest trick in the political playbook, a massive moral panic. In 1908, the Bureau of Investigation existed, but it was basically toothless. The U.S. Constitution still strictly limited what the federal government could actually do. Murder, bank robbery, and assault were still considered local state crimes. If this tiny new bureau wanted to become a real powerhouse, they needed a federal law that specifically targeted people crossing state lines. They needed an excuse. And in 1910, the media handed them the absolute perfect one. A massive, terrifying moral panic swept across the United States. Newspapers began publishing sensationalized, heavily exaggerated stories about a so-called white slave trade. The panic claimed that innocent women were being violently kidnapped off the streets and smuggled across state borders by highly organized criminal syndicates. The public was absolutely terrified. They demanded action. And the government used that exact fear to pass one of the most powerful, heavily abused laws in American history, the Mann Act of 1910. On paper, the Mann Act made it a federal crime to transport women across state lines for prostitution. But here is the genius, and the horror, of how the law was actually written. The politicians added 5 incredibly vague words to the very end of the bill. Or, for any other immoral purpose. That single phrase was the ultimate blank check. Suddenly, the invisible shield of the state line was gone. In fact, the state line literally became a trap. The exact moment you crossed it, federal agents now had the legal authority to follow you, investigate your private life, and arrest you. The Bureau exploded in size, power, and budget. They finally had real jurisdiction. But they did not just use this massive new law to stop human trafficking. They immediately began using it as a political weapon to destroy people they simply did not like. Take Jack Johnson, for example. He was the first black heavyweight boxing champion of the world. He was incredibly wealthy, proudly defiant, and deeply hated by the white establishment. Johnson frequently traveled across state lines with his white girlfriends. It was completely consensual. But the Bureau weaponized the Mann Act, legally claimed his traveling was for an immoral purpose, and systematically destroyed his life and career, eventually forcing the champion to flee the country entirely. The Bureau had successfully proven that they could use vague federal laws to crush absolutely anyone. They had the funding, and they had the jurisdiction. Now, they just needed a mastermind to take full control and turn this small agency into an unstoppable, all-seeing global empire. In 1924, a young, intensely ambitious man was appointed to run this rapidly expanding bureau. His name was J. Edgar Hoover, and he would sit in that exact chair, wielding absolute power, for the next 48 years. Hoover took the raw jurisdiction of laws like the Mann Act, combined it with massive federal funding, and built a masterpiece of modern law enforcement. He created a centralized, nationwide fingerprint database. He built state-of-the-art crime labs. He launched a massive public relations campaign to turn his federal agents into American heroes, famously hunting down notorious gangsters like John Dillinger and Al Capone. He completely erased the invisible shield of the state line. Under Hoover, if you ran, the FBI would catch you. But Hoover also did something else. He proved that the Founding Fathers, and even the corrupt politicians of 1908, were absolutely, 100% right to be terrified. Because Hoover didn't just track bank robbers. He used his massive, unchecked federal police force to build secret, highly classified files on everyone. He spied on celebrities, activists, civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., and ordinary citizens. He kept devastating dirt on sitting U.S. presidents and members of Congress. He held so much secret information that no politician, no matter how powerful, ever dared to fire him for nearly half a century. The system that was originally designed simply to catch outlaws who hopped on a train across a border had officially morphed into the exact thing everyone feared, a massive, centralized, highly secretive intelligence machine. The world before 1908 was not a safe place. The jurisdictional loopholes were a complete disaster. The privatized justice of the Pinkerton Army was brutal, corporate, and deeply unfair. But it was also a world where the power of the federal government had a hard physical limit. You could actually see where their power stopped. Today, that limit is gone. The story of how America got its federal police force is the ultimate lesson in how power actually works. A crisis happens, the public demands a solution, a new power is created in the shadows, and that power is never, ever given back. It only grows. If this story changed the way you look at the invisible lines that divide our country, and the hidden systems that control your world without your permission, hit that subscribe button. We go deep into the hidden machinery of history, money, and power. Drop a like, leave a comment, and I will see you in the next one.